Hi, this is Sarah Burgess from 1080 and welcome to our special feature on Learning at Work Week. So we did a poll recently to find out what topics you would like to see covered during Learning at Work Week, and this one was one of the most popular, so leading and managing in uncertain times. So Katherine is going to be here facilitating the session for us today. As always on these events, if you could just comment to let us know that you're here, any questions that you've got, any observations that you've got throughout the session, that really helps us just to make it as interactive as possible. So thank you for joining, and I will now hand over to Katherine to introduce herself and get going. So welcome, Katherine.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and hi everybody. My name is Katherine Lambert. I am a facilitator and coach at 1080, and I'm really looking forward to taking you through the Leading and Managing in Uncertain Times webinar today. As Sarah said, it's great if we can get you to share your thoughts, questions, observations as we go through the session. So please do put any comments in as you can. And if we could move to the next slide, Helen, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So the agenda for today is really to start off by looking at the challenges of leading through uncertainty and what that means for both yourself and your teams. We'll then explore a bit around how people actually react in uncertain times, and then look at, once we understand that, what things you can do to really support your team. We'll then take that a stage further with thinking about what actually matters to people and what's important to people. And again, what can we learn about the individuals who we lead and manage to really understand the support structures we can put in place. And we will then wrap that all together, a few hints and tips, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end as well. So what I'd like to do before we go into the content of today is really just get your perspective on some of this. So Helen, if you could change the slide for me. Thank you. And what I'd like you to reflect on is, what over the more recent months would you say have been the challenges for both you and your team? And let's look at this from both the home and the work aspect, because obviously although we tend to think about some of these things in a work context, home is also something that's come increasingly into our working lives recently. So I'll just give you a moment, have a reflect and jot down some comments. Okay, just give another minute or so. Okay, Sarah, anything coming through?
No comments so far. Oops. Okay, so there's a couple of comments coming through now. So Laura says juggling home with children. So yes, I would agree with that. That's been definitely quite a challenge. Katherine, have you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Becca's just said onboarding new people as well. And I imagine some of this is the fact that a lot of this is still in the virtual space as well. I certainly relate to the one around juggling work and children. I've done a fair few focus groups recently, focusing on mental health and well-being, and a lot of things that came out there in terms of some of these challenges with uncertainty is the fact that boundaries, just like have been described between work and home, are really beginning to blur, and there's this feeling of always being on. I think people have really talked about how they're missing interactions with individuals face to face. I think there's other individuals who really share how they're nervous just about going back to the office and what that might look like for them. And I also hear a lot where people talk about that actually the business or organisation or team, the priorities are really changing. But at the same time, a lot of the work that they were doing previously is still expected to be delivered. And so they are feeling real burnout and finding it very difficult to manage all these challenging priorities, all in the face of uncertainty. What about yourself, Sarah? Any other thoughts from you from that one?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. The juggling work with children. I think a lot of people kind of sort of say it was young children that was really difficult. But I actually found with older children it was quite difficult as well, trying to get them to kind of focus on their schoolwork. I think they found that very difficult. And I think the boundaries for them changed a lot, didn't they? It was almost like they had suddenly gone to university at age 14 or something, because they had to then try to self-manage themselves. So I think that's been really hard from our family. And in terms of work, I guess just not having face-to-face meetings, I think you did lose something initially, although definitely. I think people have got more used to that now.
Yes, absolutely. And I think Becca's point there, that's on the comments around onboarding new people. I mean, I've had a number of individuals who have started jobs and never met their team face to face. Of course, as you say, you adapt and you do that virtually. But there are a large number of people and leaders who will be bringing people in a virtual space at the moment, which is it does take longer to build those connections and relationships. So there's
Absolutely.
a lot of different challenges, I think, that come out at the moment.
Yeah, I think structure has been one for, I was going to say structure, I think has been one for me. I think it's really hard sometimes on days when you've got lots of work, you kind of like don't actually know where to start. And similarly on days when you haven't, I think it's been very hard to find some sort of structure that works and that you can kind of stick to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a comment from Michael now to say team homeschooling and the need to stay in contact as we have not been meeting on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And that will cause communication difficulties and everything else. So there's a huge amount of challenges that are still the case. And even as this week, some of the restrictions are lifting, we still are facing a huge element of uncertainty, aren't we? There's still a lot in the press around, what that will actually look like going forward. So I think there is still a lot of uncertainty around, will continue. So as leaders and managers, this is as important as it would have been when we first faced into this pandemic over a year ago. So let's thank you all for your comments there and your thoughts and observations on that. Let's have a think about what happens when we experience some of those challenges. So Helen, if you could change the slide for me, please. Fantastic, thank you. So this is an example of a change curve. It is based on Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And essentially what this describes is the fact that we go through differing levels of emotion as we experience change or uncertainty or at times of transition. So as you can see, you have morale and competence on the side axis, and then we're looking at this over time. And so we go through these range of emotions that tend to decrease over time, and our morale becomes lower. And then over time, we hopefully have some things that start to become a bit more positive, and it starts to move towards integration and us accepting that change. And if we use an example that will be very relevant for people at the moment, so for example, if we suddenly said to our teams, right, we're going to ask you to come back into the office, we'd like you to come back 3 days a week, and we'd like you to do that from the middle of June. Now, individuals are likely to start off by feeling shock. They may be surprised at the fact that this is happening and that there's actually a date set for it. No matter how much you've communicated, it's still likely when that is a definite that there is some sort of shock. And very quickly we'll move into denial about it. Well, actually, I don't think they're going to make me move back into the office. I'm working really well from home, actually, and I don't think that's something that's going to affect me. So very quickly can move into feelings of denial and look for reasons as to why this may not happen for them. After that, as it becomes clearer that these things may happen, it can lead to feelings of frustration. and individuals their morale starts to decrease. They might want to put that outwardly. So actually, I don't think it's fair that I'm going in. I'm not going to. My commute's going to be a nightmare, and it's just not right that I should be made to. All sorts of feelings of frustration, and essentially projecting the feelings outwardly. And as time goes on, that can move and morale can shift downwards even further. And actually, we take that inwardly. And so feelings of depression, lacking energy, low mood can take over. I don't even know if I can do this face-to-face anymore. I'm really good when I'm 2D virtually, but I don't know if I've got the confidence to have those conversations personally. And I don't know if I really want to do this. Perhaps this job isn't for me. What happens after that, though, is there will be some things that start to feel a bit more positive. Well, actually, the first time I went in, it was okay. I had a really good conversation with somebody, and it was actually just really enjoyable seeing people. Or the commute wasn't as bad as I thought. It was all right, actually. And this starts to build, and the momentum and our morale starts to lift, and we start to move towards integration, where we have essentially accepted the new change or transition. And so that might be, well, actually, I quite enjoy going in now, and I really like the fact to have the opportunity to flex my style and work sometimes from home and sometimes at work, and I think I work more effectively in this way. So you can really see how the change curve can have differing emotions for different situations. The thing that's really important to think about with a curve such as this is that all of these emotions are completely natural and normal, and we all will go through this to some level, whether we are a leader who's instigating the change or we're a team member. It's likely we'll all go through some of these emotions. However, what will happen is some people maybe go through the change curve quicker than others. Some people might find the dip is shallower for them, or it might be much deeper. And the other thing to remember is this is really dynamic. So it might seem like your team are starting to move to the more positive feelings, and then something happens, they have a setback and they move back into the dip. And so this is a dynamic, ever-evolving situation. We might be going through lots of different change curves with different things that are going on, either at home or at work or with different projects. And so understanding this and thinking about, as leaders, how we might want to help support people to hopefully make that dip a little bit shallower and shorter in terms of the time can be a really powerful way to think about this. So let's move on. If we could go on to the next slide, and let's think a little bit about why we experience some of these emotions. Well, we all have brains that are designed to keep us safe from danger, and actually to decide who is friend or foe. And we actually have more emotions and experience more emotions when it comes to dealing with a threat than a reward. Now, our reptilian parts of our brains, the oldest part of our brain, is constantly therefore scanning our environment, looking for threats. Now, this served us really well when we were cavemen and women, and there was a real chance of being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or something happened to us that made us ill. But this still comes in and kicks in if we have some sort of perceived threat. And it's a physiological reaction. I'm sure you've heard the fight or flight response will kick in those instances. And if we're unsure about something, that will be classified in our brains as a threat. And so we're likely to have our fight or flight response kick in. So if we do have a perceived threat, what then happens? So Helen, if you're all right to change the slide for me. Thank you. So Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about the fact there are two independent systems going on at work in our brains. So we have a rational and planning side, or conscious system. If you think of the analogy of a rider and an elephant, we'd talk about that being the rider. And then we also have this emotional side, which feels pain or pleasure, which we again would describe as the elephant. And we think about the fact that the rider, this rational planning side of our brain, it's almost like the chief executive of our brains. It's where complex decisions happen, and it's where we make most of our decisions from. But in the way a rider is sitting at the top and seems to be a leader, there are times when actually, if we do perceive some sort of threat, then the elephant will take over. And the rider, we actually take blood and oxygen from the prefrontal cortex part of our brain, that rider part of our brain and divert it to the elephant so that we're ready to have our response, our physiological response of fight or flight. And so whenever we're faced with uncertain or challenging situations, the emotional side of the brain is very likely to take over. The elephant will take over. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, please, Helen.
I just saw a question come up actually in relation to that slide. Hannah, are you able to put it up? Excellent. So from Michael, why hasn't humankind evolved not to deal with these perceived threats?
That's a really good question, isn't it? I think I don't have a definitive answer to that one, Michael. Why is the elephant in control? So again, we do still have this very old part of our brains, the amygdala, that will take over in those instances. And although we have evolved to have these much bigger brains than the prefrontal cortex, and we are able to make complex decisions, at times where we are in stress or fearful, the physiological response still will kick in. Now, there are times when that will still be needed now. We don't have the saber-toothed tiger example, but there are times when we will need to fight or flight, and therefore it's still a really important physiological reaction to us. But although we have evolved, it's still there. So I think the evolving is the fact we have that prefrontal cortex, the rider, but there are still times when it will overtake. I don't know, Sarah, have you got anything you'd add to that at all?
I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I think you're right. There's definitely times when it's fight or flight, isn't there? So
Yeah.
my mind's gone a bit blank, but yes. So
absolutely. So yes, so it is something that's evolved over time. It's made us more sophisticated, but we still have these emotional reactions, and they are important as well. So if we move, thank you, Michael, for that question.
And Jill's just come back to say we're emotional beings who can think and do logic rather than logical beings that emote.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Jill. So in terms of a summary to this, in terms of our response to uncertainty, just as a bit of a flow chart. So we perceive something that's uncertain. We're likely to perceive that, therefore, as a threat. Our threat response, therefore, kicks in, that physiological response. And that will increase our feelings of anxiety and fear. And that will take the blood away, as I've said, from the prefrontal cortex. It reduces our ability to focus and think clearly. And then we get impaired performance and increased emotion when those things happen. So it just sort of describes it in a different way, still using that analogy. Great. If we move on to the next slide, please, Helen. Thank you. So what can we do about this as leaders? And I think the very first thing to say is that it's really important that we start by thinking about all of this for ourselves before we start thinking about what we will do for our team or individuals within our team. Because we are likely to have the same emotional reactions when we perceive a threat or are going through uncertainty in exactly the same way as our teams. And what we want to do is ultimately try to get back to balance. So when we are connected to our rational parts of our brains and the logical part of our brain and our emotional part of our brains. And so one of the ways that can be really helpful, and all the examples I use today, I think you can think of for yourself as a leader or a manager, as well as how you can use these as tips to help your team. But thinking about your sphere of control can be really powerful. So there will be elements that are within our control. There will be some that may not be directly in our control, but are in our influence. And there will be some elements that aren't in our control or influence. And so one of the things that can be really powerful to start off is really just think about what are the things that are within my control or my influence, and focus my intention on those, and try to divert attention and energy away from the things that we have no control and influence over. And you can literally use this model to draw the circles and think about, right, what is in my control, what's in my influence, what are the things that are areas of concern, but actually I have no control of influence over. And by doing that, you're acknowledging the fact they're there, but then focusing your attention and energy on your control, what's within your control and influence. The reason why this can be so helpful is because it helps us feel like we have made choices about how we act, what we pay attention to, what we do. And that can take us away of feelings of resentment and obligation and move us into positions where we feel empowered to start to take action. So I've really encouraged you to use this for yourselves first as leaders, but it's obviously also a great opportunity to think about how you might want to help your teams navigate through this using this sphere of control as well. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Helen? Thank you. So again, the same question, thinking about this elephant versus rider analogy, what else can we do as leaders? So I would always say the first thing to think about is actually what are the clues that your team are showing or displaying that might indicate to you that they are feeling uncertain? Are they, for example, asking the same question over and over again? That can tend to say there's some sort of resistance going on and might be telling you that there's something going underneath the surface here. Are they actually displaying emotions that you can see visibly? Are they angry, upset, frustrated? It might be that they've gone unusually quiet. You will know your teams best, and therefore you will be able to see what those clues are. But by understanding what to look out for, that can be really helpful in starting to think about how you start to address this with your teams. And once you've seen those clues, some of the things you want to do is try to get your team back to balance. So first of all, think about how can you direct the rider by tuning into their rational side, asking questions like, what is it we're trying to achieve here? Or what is the plan of action? Or what things could you do that will start to move us forward? Or who can help you? Or what resources are there to help you? Can always be really helpful questions to start people connecting back into that rational side of their brains. It's also useful to think about how you can motivate the elephant. So once you've directed the rider and you've started to help them think about how they might want to think about focusing on their rational side, acknowledging and tuning into the emotions is going to be really important as well. So recognizing people's emotions, what are you seeing and observing, and calling those out and helping them see it for themselves, acknowledging the fact that there is uncertainty, perhaps even sharing how you feel around some of that uncertainty. That will always all validate and normalize feelings, and that in itself allows them to tune into that and start to think about how they can move that forward. The other thing that can be really useful as a leader is to think about the situation and the environment for your team. So how can you shape the path? Individuals tend to be motivated to move forward, but they also tend to have friction that might stop them moving towards the path that perhaps you want them to navigate. So thinking about what is the path of least resistance and how can you make it easy for your team to really follow that right path will be really helpful. You might be able to anticipate some obstacles that might get in their way and navigate and help them think about how they might navigate around those, or maybe you can move those obstacles out the way to help them move forward. And again, thinking about the change curve, what are some of the actions you could take to help the change curve be shallower and quicker? It might even be just showing them the change curve and acknowledging that this happens for everybody, and getting them to talk about where they are and what they might need in order to move them forward can be really powerful. So what I'd like you to do is, as leaders, just reflect on each of these areas. And what are some of the things that you could do in the context that you're in with your team to understand and look for clues, think about how you might direct the rider and tune into that rational side, how you might motivate the elephant and tune into the emotional side, and also shape the path and try and support them navigate that journey. So we'll just give you a few moments to reflect on that. Okay, Sarah, any comments coming in at the moment?
Nothing so far. So I've just been thinking a bit about some work that I do at a water sports and activity centre. So I'm a trustee there, and I guess this kind of fits in also here as well, because it is kind of work as well. But in terms of things like directing the rider, I think the issues that we're potentially having there is, first of all, people like coaches and not coming back just yet, and also our members. So I guess in terms of the direction there, it's about letting people know kind of current government guidelines, what they can do, what they can't do. So kind of very much factual information, and sending out regular communications to our kind of volunteers, other trustees, members about what we can and can't be doing, and finding out who is available to help, because people, may have got other responsibilities and they can't commit the time they used to. So I think that seems to me to be quite factual, that first section.
Yeah, fantastic.
And then in terms of the motivating, I guess it's thinking about, some people are going to be nervous. I know that we've got some people that are saying they don't think they're ever going to not wear a mask. So it's sort of acknowledging those things, really, that uncertainty, like you've said. And then moving on to shaping, thinking about reassurance, asking people what they want to do, give people options, so that people do feel as comfortable as possible to return to whatever it is, whether it's work or in our case, our activity centre.
Yeah, fantastic. And I love that idea of options, because again, it allows people an element of choice, doesn't it? Which again goes back to feeling empowered and thinking, right, what way am I choosing to take this, rather than sort of having all options available and not really knowing which way to turn with it. I think Hannah's put a comment in here as well.
Yeah, so Hannah's saying, I think we need to think about our emotional response as leaders and ensure we support our team.
Yeah, so really important.
Great. And then we've got a comment from Adrian saying the challenge for leaders is that the situational diversity aspect, i.e. everyone's situation is different, needs a whole new level of engagement to have those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important, isn't it, Adrian? And everyone, we know that. I mean, even just in some of the examples and challenges that we got at the beginning, they will be different depending on those situations. And that does make it difficult, because we'll talk later about consistency and how important that is. But actually, we do need to think about it on a situational level. And therefore, that does add to the challenge. But I think the key is around communicating, making sure you're talking to your teams, as is always the case. Sometimes it can also be thinking around help people think about times when they have had change or transition, and how actually they have benefited them in the past, or helping them understand the benefits that they've seen in the past and how they might take that into the future, can also be really powerful.
So I can see a few more comments coming through here. So Michael's saying, I think it's very important to try to understand the individual motivations of team members.
Yeah.
Jill tells me elephants like pineapples. Okay, interesting. Adrian said, so much energy is required. And then I saw a comment. Sorry, carry on.
I was going to just say on that, and I think that's why it's so important for us to think about ourselves first, because actually if we are feeling absolutely exhausted and actually, I'm going to have another one of those conversations, then actually what are the things that you can do to really help yourself? It is that oxygen mask before helping others, isn't it? Because actually if you're not balanced yourself and maybe feeling emotional or frustrated, those conversations are less likely to go as well. And so it's a really important point that Adrian makes. And I think Michael's saying the same thing and agreeing there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Adrian's point is well made, and we need to be more employee-centric as leaders. Thank you. And then Laura has come up with a different comment, saying, I think it's about shrinking the change into smaller chunks that the team can achieve.
Yeah, I really love that. I always think if someone's feeling really emotionally flooded and you're trying to get into that rational side, is it about saying, what is the one thing you can do to start to think about how you take action? So you're not even getting to action yet, but what you're doing is trying to, as Laura says, chunk it up to start to move people forward. And, bite-sized small chunks might feel more manageable than looking at the entire roadmap and where you're headed. That might just be too overwhelming.
Absolutely. I guess you feel like you're getting somewhere as well, don't you, if you're maybe even ticking things off of a list?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. There's a sense of achievement in it.
So we've got a anonymous comment, which is recognizing and understanding people's emotions is important. Much easier to provide support and guidance then. So absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree, because if you don't face into the fact that there are emotions underneath all of this, then you're just talking at the periphery, and therefore some of the root cause of some of this just won't get addressed, and therefore you won't be able to support and guide them in the way that maybe is most relevant for them. So it is really important to not only understand it, but to acknowledge it and try and encourage people to talk about it. I think that's really important.
Yeah. I guess maybe, like you say, trying to understand if someone's coming across maybe in an angry kind of way, then what is it because they're scared of something? So thinking a bit like that, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you for your comments there. And actually that leads really nicely into the next stage. So if we can change the slide, please, Helen. About really thinking about what matters to people. And this is taking this on a level, just like you've said, Sarah. And so any sort of organizational change can often be associated with loss. And so again, in those instances, our brains will focus on the threats, as we've talked about, and we'll perceive what we might lose in terms of times of uncertainty. So again, getting really to understand what matters to those individuals is going to make a big difference to how you therefore support and guide them. So the sort of things that tend to come up, and David Rock has done a lot of research into this. So the sort of things are status. So our sense of status is actually one of our biggest predictors of long-term health. And so if we receive a threat or a perceived threat to status, we will respond as if it is a real threat. We've already talked about the physiological reaction that will happen there. And so understanding how uncertainty may be causing the team to feel a loss of status can be very useful to then help manage and support those situations and feelings. So have they always been known as being an expert in a certain area for the team and the go-to person, and is suddenly there a change in terms of what people are working on, so they're feeling like they might lose that sense of being an expert? That might be an example where someone might feel a loss of status. As some of the team moving from under them to somebody else, again, that can have a sense of status, and there can be an impact there. There's lots of examples where the status that we feel about ourselves can have a real impact because it matters so much to us. The next one is around certainty. Our brains are a prediction machine. They really crave certainty. Again, even a small amount will create this sensation that something is wrong. We've already started to think a little bit about what we can do in terms of that. Autonomy, again, if we feel we have control over work, that will hugely reduce our stress levels. Micromanagement can reduce feelings of control and can also start to cause this threat response. So again, this is where it's really important to think about that for yourself as a leader, because if you're craving control in an uncertain environment and one of the things you do is try to micromanage your team, then you might be having a knock-on impact that you aren't aware of, but can be having that sense of loss of some of the team that you're working with as well. Relatedness, we are social animals and we crave a feeling of belonging and being in a social group. And so small groups tend to make us feel better and give us more opportunities to connect with others. And fairness, we already talked about the fact that if we're looking at situational leadership and looking at each individual, how do we ensure that what we do is still consistent and fair? Because if we feel that there is an action that is unjust or unfair, that again will cause that threat response to take place. So have a think about whether there's anything in that, or observations or comments or questions on that. But there are some things that we can think about doing as leaders in order to support some of those if we think they might be relevant for our team. So Helen, if you could take the slide on to the next one. So think a little bit around how you can reduce the perceived threat and loss that uncertainty brings for your team, thinking about those different elements and what they might mean for you. And I'm going to just give you a few examples as we go through. So Helen, if you could just click to the next one. So in terms of status, It could be about recognizing the contribution that they have made so far, to reassure them of their value, to appreciate their work. There might be something around, if work is changing, the nature of it is changing in some way, is there a way of helping them understand that the work that they've done up till now hasn't been wasted? Because that can be a really demotivating place to be. So thinking about some of those things to really help, if you think status might be something that someone is feeling a perceived loss of, can be really helpful as a leader. Helen, do you mind moving on to the next one? Thank you. Certainty, again, this is all around acknowledging those feelings, trying to reassure them when you can. What certainty can you give them? What is really important here is that you think about your own sphere of control and influence, because if we said in March last year, don't worry, in 6 weeks' time, it'll all be back to normal, we'll be back in the office, everything will be fine. We know in hindsight that wasn't the case. And I talk a lot around bounded optimism, which is around looking for the sort of painting a picture of the positives, but making sure it's within your sphere of control, so it's bounded in reality in some way. Because if people had environments where they thought, oh well, I've just got to get through the next 2 months and then it will be fine, when that deadline comes, you can find that very difficult to move past that and keep yourself motivated. It can feel very demoralizing. So bounded optimism is a really useful way of thinking as a leader around how you paint that picture, but still give certainty where you can. Helen, if you could put it to the next one, please. Autonomy, again, help them think about how they can reflect on their sphere of control and influence. Think about how you're feeling around that yourself. How can you ensure you're still empowering them to be able to not micromanage them, essentially, can be really, really important. So really think about what's in their sphere of control and influence, and help them think about that for themselves as well, can be really, really useful as leaders. Helen, can you move on to the next one? Relatedness, and I'm sure a lot of you are doing this anyway, but it is time together as a team in smaller groups, encouraging people to find ways of connecting with each other, which isn't just through team meetings where it maybe is all focused on the task. All of those things can help. And it's something I've really observed over the last year, is that there has been more, in a lot of businesses, a lot more interactions as a team than there would have been before, probably a bit through necessity, but actually it's allowing that relatedness to happen. It might be that you just say, when you're not on meetings, that the Zoom can be open to anybody to go and have a chat, whatever it might be, but allowing people to have those connections even in the virtual world. And hopefully as we move into seeing each other in person, we'll be able to do even more of that. And then Helen, if you can move on finally to the last one, fairness. So it's really important to reflect on this bit around how can you ensure consistency in your approach, especially if you are using that situational leadership approach of thinking about each individual and what is the context for them and what do they need. If the team perceive unfairness or inconsistency, then that can again cause a threat response. So thinking about, at least, are there knock-ons in terms of the decisions I'm making, and do I need to be very mindful of those, can be a really useful and powerful way of thinking about it. Any comments or anything coming up there, Sarah, or does everyone?
Not just yet, no, not just yet.
Yep. Great, so food for thought.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I'm thinking that the fairness one seems the most difficult one, I think, to kind of manage from my view, because like you say, how, if everyone's got different needs and requirements, how, yeah, it kind of, fairness, you kind of think of this logical approach, but actually that's not necessarily going to be the case, is it?
Yeah, no, I agree. I do think that one is particularly tricky. I think there's something about really understanding what the consistency looked like previously, so that you're very aware of when you're making changes that are different to that, because people will very quickly think that is the new norm. And so if you start to then make changes, they will think, well, that's how we work now, and that's my new psychological contract with you, and if you make a change to that now, that I perceive that to be unfair. So it's not an easy one to work through, but I think if you're not mindful of it, you could create some disgruntlement in the team that you're not aware of. So I think it's really important to be aware of it, even though there's no quick fix or easy solution to that. I don't think. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so if we wrap this up in terms of hints and tips, and we'll get you to reflect on the question, the kicker, in a moment. But so I would always say the first thing to do is to start with yourself. And we've already heard people acknowledge how it is taking a lot of energy. This isn't easy. It's been going on a long time now, and the uncertainty hasn't yet lifted. But thinking about what you can do to help yourself first is going to be really important, so that you can at least get to balance, or as close to balance as possible, before you move into having these conversations with your teams. Then think about the clues you're observing in your team's behavior and what you might want to do to address some of those. Think about the change curve. You might even want to get your team to describe where they are on it and some of the things that they might say they need in order to make their curve shallower and hopefully shorter in terms of a time frame as well. Really acknowledging your team's emotions and reactions, and really trying to understand what's important to them, as we were just talking about previously, and help your team identify what's in their sphere of control. We've talked a lot also about communication, and I would encourage you to communicate even when you don't have anything really to say. So even if there's no change, what people will tend to do if there is silence is they will fill that with their own stories and narrative. And that may or may not be true. And so the more that you can communicate and regularly, even if it's just to say there's no change yet, however, we will update you when we can, the more you can communicate, the better. Because what you don't want is those silences and gaps to be filled with people's narratives and stories that they'll probably talk to each other about, and starts to create rumours and whispers that perhaps you then need to then undo or unpick in order to move them back to where you need them to be as a team. So I think communication is always going to be key. Is there anything you'd add to that, Sarah? Oh, I've got a comment in.
So there's Michael's. Well. Yeah. So Michael's saying, as a HR professional, consistency has been the watchword. However, tailoring the job to the individual needs is often at odds with that consistency.
Yeah, I think it is one of the trickiest. It's a really tricky element to navigate through. But as I say, I do think just being mindful of it is a good place to start. And I guess thinking with every decision you make, if someone else asked me, well, what was the reason for that? Have you got a good answer to that? Because then that starts to help, at least with the openness of it. And again, that's back to communication, I think, definitely.
Absolutely. And going back to you just asked me before Michael's comment came up. So I think that communication one is just so important. So I've got a couple of clients that are working in the leisure industry, and it's been very, very difficult for them because they were kind of on furlough for a long time with pretty much zero communication from their employer, and then suddenly had 48 hours notice to say they were going back to work, wow. With no kind of additional training, and had to then deal with members of the public who are obviously experiencing all sorts of emotions about getting back to exercise. So that's just caused so much stress from the individuals concerned themselves, but also in the how to deal with the members of public and their issues as well. So I think, communication and what to expect when you're back in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And so were there any examples of things that they had done or were going to do to communicate in that context?
No, that's the thing. They just kind of went back to work, and then were sort of being greeted by customers not happy with the new rules because they were only allowed certain people in studios or in pools or things like that. So they had to then deal with these emotions that they weren't really trained to do. So just kind of getting chucked back in at the deep end, I guess.
Yeah. And I think even if there are times when things like that happen, or there's not in that example, but generally as a manager, if something has happened and it's unintended, I still think there's opportunities at that point to re-communicate, reset what's going on, hear the feedback, move it forward.
Absolutely,
because that's what's going to sort of move that situation into hopefully a more positive one, which obviously that must have been very difficult.
It was difficult, And I think they've kind of learned from it now, and they're clearer on what to expect from people now, and they've got an escalation process and things like that in place now. So it's better than it was. So I guess they've learned from each time we've kind of gone in and out of lockdown. It's new for everyone, wasn't it? So
yeah, very much so. But it is again back to communication being key. And if you don't do it right the first time, that doesn't mean there isn't an opportunity to address it and move it forward, I think. Great. So if we move into the last slide, please, Helen. And this is really just an opportunity for you all to reflect for yourselves and just think about what is it that you've taken from today, for you to think what is the first action you're going to take and when will you complete it? How are you going to break that down into manageable chunks, like Laura said, to start to move yourself forward? And actually a question along the lines of, well, how will I know I've succeeded, can really help you. It's a great coaching question that I ask quite often. But so just reflect on what is it that you've taken, what's the first action you're going to take, and when will you complete that by, and how will you know you've succeeded? And if you are able to put anything into the comments or have any questions, please do so.
So as nothing's coming through just yet, I think so Liz then, sorry, Laura. So Laura has said, engage with the team about what's going well and what isn't, so we can praise the good and address the not so good by guiding the elephant effectively. So excellent use of the terminology there. Thank you, Laura.
Great use of the analogy. Thank you.
Great.
I do really like the praising the good. Again, whenever there are quick wins or things that have gone well, I think the more you can highlight those, that can also help with the increase of morale if people are on the change curve as well. So the more they see how far up the hill they climbed when they look back down, it does start to really help build the feelings of morale in a team. So I think that one's particularly important.
Yeah. Okay. So Michael said, great session, Catherine. I'm really pleased that 1080 is supporting Learning at Work Week. So thank you for that, Michael.
Sarah, did you have some reflections? You were about to say something before Laura made her comment.
Yes, I think I was just going to say, kind of going back to the trustee work and the importance of the communication. So just thinking really clearly about what we can and can't do now, let people know that, so that hopefully we can move on and get lots of new members and get lots of people out on the water.
Fantastic. Great.
So thank you. It's been interesting.
Great.
Excellent.
So I don't think we've got any other questions coming up. So thanks everybody for joining us today and your comments and observations. And Sarah, I think you're just going to talk about the next one that we've got.
Absolutely. Yeah, so thank you, Catherine. It's been really interesting. I've been kind of put on the spot a couple of times, so hopefully that was okay. So we will be back on Thursday. So this was another topic that came out in the poll that we ran about looking for kind of good topics for Learning at Work Week. So we'll be talking with Jill, who's going to be facilitating a session all about managing with compassion and empathy in ambiguous times. So that will be great for anyone who can join us. So please do go and register for the event. I've just seen there's another comment coming up here. So it says, employee voice, making sure employees are always listened to and appropriate action is taken, Jonathan Henwood. Yeah. So thank you for that. We will go through and have a look at all the comments again after the show. So if there's any observations or questions you want to ask, then please do carry on, add them to the chat, and Catherine will have a look through and answer those. And we'll probably put some short comments to each of the questions that came up as well, so you can kind of go back and look at those afterwards. So again, yeah, we're back Thursday for Managing with Compassion and Empathy. We also have got a LinkedIn live session tomorrow at 12, which I'll be talking to two of my colleagues, Alison Ainsworth and Chris Thorne, about informational interviews. So that's our regular Wednesday slot. So if anyone wants to come to that, you're very welcome. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining. Hope to see you Wednesday or Thursday this week. Thanks again to Catherine. And thank you very much. So we're going to end the broadcast now. So bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.